Well, let's start the program in the United States, where President Donald Trump's position on the African continent will be under scrutiny when he meets Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta later on Monday. Now, the talks are expected to dwell on security and trade. Kenya is expected to push for an increase in export volumes under the AGOA program that grants African countries duty-free access to US markets. Now, this is only the second time the US president is meeting an African head of state since taking office last year. Trump has been described as largely unconcerned about the continent, though in April he did meet Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari and tweeted about South Africa's land reform last week. Kenya's ambassador to the US, Njeru Githae, says the US is keen on realizing the potential for mutual benefits by trading with Africa.
Now America is looking towards Africa. So it's not us who look to the east, it is America that had ignored Africa. And I've said that to them several times. Yeah, and they admitted that they are not looked to Africa as a trade partner. But now they are. Yeah, and you can see from the number of companies that have set up base in Nairobi, you know, and we want even more of them to set up base in Nairobi.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined in the studio by Dr. Francis Onditi, an international relations expert. Dr. Onditi, always a pleasure having you with us. Now, we haven't seen much interaction between Trump and African heads of states. Do you think this particular visit by President Kenyatta marks a shift in Trump's relationship with Africa?
I think US, under the leadership of Donald Trump, it cannot forsake African countries, particularly Kenya being in the Horn of Africa. We are aware that the government of US, White House, is pumping a lot of resources in security around the Horn of Africa, particularly in Somalia, within the framework of the African Union mission in Somalia. And therefore, Kenya is seen as a strategic location or strategic country from which the U.S. can actually expand, you know, their mission and the dreams, you know, in Africa. So I see a relationship coming out strongly based on the strategic location of Kenya and the interest that the U.S. has in Somalia particularly.
And of course the United States, as you said, you know, shouldn't be forsaking Africa, and it has actually argued that it's got better proposition for African countries than those that are offered, for instance, by initiatives like the Belt and Road Project. What's your view on that statement?
I would say this. The relation between African countries, particularly Kenya and the U.S., is basically based on what you could call, you know, a proxy relationship, because the U.S. has its own interest, either in terms of trade or in terms of security, protecting and preserving the security of the people of America, wherever they are. So whenever there is an opportunity for them to, you know, to strengthen their relation with the African countries, so be it. So for Kenya, it's very, very strategic, and the East Africa at large. Don't forget that U.S. has a bigger base, you know, in the Horn of Africa, in Djibouti, which is supposed to monitor the Indian Ocean waters. Is also supposed to put, you know, a protective kind of, you know, mechanism against the terrorism and extremist group in the Horn of Africa. So yeah, I foresee the relationship getting more stronger. Not because African countries wants to benefit more from the U.S., but more of interest that the U.S. has in Africa, particularly in the Horn.
And is there anything to be observed in the timing of this visit, particularly because it seems that Donald Trump has so many internal political issues to deal with and other external issues such as the trade dispute with China?
Yeah, basically there is a strong, you know, balance of power competition going on between China and the U.S. So the visit of President Uhuru in the U.S., it's a routine, but I think it goes beyond the normal to speak to volume that the U.S. still has a grip in Africa, and particularly countries that seem to be embedded between conflicts. Kenya is embedded in the conflict in the Horn of Africa, and South Sudan is just settling its conflict. So the strategic positioning of Kenya as a country makes it a very important point for the U.S., as much as the competition between U.S. and China will continue, particularly the trade wars that have been going on. But I think, you know, the Kenyan foreign policy has been what we call a balanced kind of policy, whereby they wouldn't want to lose the West, but at the same time they want to enter into new markets, particularly China, because China has been providing an opportunity for African countries to excel in trade and infrastructure. So yeah, that balance, I think it is really the thing for Kenya. And that's why President Uhuru Kenyatta has a big responsibility of making sure that the balance remain stable.
And finally, very quickly, Dr. Nditi, Trump has obviously met with Muhammadu Buhari, and he's said to have described him as lifeless. Do you think that Trump and Kenyatta will get along? There'll be chemistry between these two men, perhaps?
Kenya has a long history between, between the country and U.S. You're not likely to see a bad blood between Kenya and the U.S. And particularly in the recent past, President Uhuru has been making a lot of effort in fight against corruption. We've had a lot of milestones, even though a few political hiccups here and there. So those gains that President Uhuru has had in the last, for example, 10 months or a few years since he took over, gives him a leverage to have a strong bargaining power in White House. Yeah, so we don't expect bad blood between the two presidents. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Francis Nditi, on that.